colleagues, I'd like to preface my talk by acknowledging UNISA Press for having made available the primary text on which my talk focuses. And the book, of course, is called Selby Mvusi, To Fly with the North Bird South, and it was compiled. It's a monograph compiled by the author Elza Miles. And I guess basically what I'm trying to do here is to pose the rhetorical question: what would be the point of writing poetry, literature? What would be the point of producing art at large if there won't be platforms to talk about this art? And basically, I'm trying to say, here I am, and I'm talking about this, trying to learn this art, and in the process, opening up conversations on this art. Now, I'm going to talk, possibly eulogize UNISA Press, not only because, it has given me this book, but also because of late, and I really don't know much about UNISA Press except, from 2011. Of late, UNISA Press is doing brilliant stuff. In 2010, it produced this book, pardon, the small image, and it is a monograph on Pitika Ntuli's creative output. What Pitika Ntuli does in this monograph is to produce his poetry in dialogue with the images of his sculptures. And the sculptures are many, starting with granite, to metal, to bone. I find his bone sculptures particularly intriguing and enthralling. But back to the subject of my paper, which is on Selby Mvusi's, on Elza Miles' book, Selby Mvusi, To Fly with the North Bird South. It does not seem that studies on the experimentations across disciplines and genres in the South African literary history have been aggressive and sustained. Much of what has been produced on this theme draws exclusively from the primary text of the written or literary word. And as many speakers have said before me, by that we mean referring to the English word. This gap is concerning, actually frightening, as it is on this account that there has not yet been scholarship which establishes bridges between, for instance, Pitika Ntuli's book, the image of which I've just shown, who performs the African by synchronizing prose, poetry, sculpture, music, and dance, and on the other hand, Selby Mvusi, who is another artist who engages a comparable intertextual preoccupation. And the little that we have on Credo Mutua, if we're talking about indigenous knowledge system, because that's what, the name of Pitika Ntuli calls to mind, indigenous knowledge system. And what also comes to mind is the author and performer Credo Mutua. But regrettably, the little that we have on Credo Mutua is in the form of tabloid reports, not much, critical analysis of his poetry and art. In these artists' respective works, the classic African narrative, borne out in the exuberance of emotions, prevails. Here, different genres and realisms run into each other, opening up debates with modernism and postmodernism, and these are Western trends. This is a brilliant take, especially in this post-humanist age, that is one that takes note of the limitations of the written word, where we celebrate the collapse of genre, or to rephrase, where we celebrate trans and interdisciplinary studies. In adopting a comprehensive approach to humanities, these texts lay the foundation to explore the reasons why individuals and movements break ranks with the norm. And this has been happening here in Africa well before the euphoria termed post-coloniality or post-colonialism, and of late, the madness with the concept of decoloniality. Now, the recent publication of Elza Miles' book, Selby Mvusi, provides a welcome opportunity to revisit the theme of the making of a South African black modern intellectual, and to explore the usefulness of the concept of genre and authority, containing Mvusi's poetry, the images of his visual art, and of his sculpture, as well as the lectures that he presented across the world as an academic and practicing artist. This book conveys a transdisciplinary construct of what it means to be a new subject, a newness, Mvusi argues overtly in his 1958 poem, I and They, neither materializes in too many words nor can it be compartmentalized, because it is the presence of the renegades such as Galileo. Is this a lesson for us? I think it is. Mvusi's life story makes it tempting to explore this thesis. He was born in 1929, a century later than what is arguably conceived of as the birth of the progenitor of the South African black modern intellectual who is known to be Theo Soga in 1820, who was born in 1829 and died in 1871, in what is today referred to as KwaZulu-Natal. Mvusi was educated at Fort Hare University at the time when it became the launching pad of the ideas that led to the formation of the African National Congress Youth League in 1944. He then returned to enroll for the specialist art teachers course in Durban to teach art, and also spent some time apprenticed with the famous and progressive Black, Indian, and colored arts groups, famed for, Bika. And this is another lesson for us, because for me, what also comes to mind is FUBA, which has been located in Soweto, which is also a launching pad for writers across genres, across realisms. And basically what I'm trying to emphasize here for creative writers is that we cannot afford to be creative writers in our own compartments. We depend on university press, we depend on publishing presses, but we also depend on intellectuals or wannabe intellectuals to talk about your work, our work. Introducing Mvusi as alumnus of the University of Fort Hare of the time seems to insert his life story in that of the formation of the African National Youth Congress. This history is iconizing the profiles of Nelson Mandela, as well as the core of the students such as Robert Mugabe, who later emerged to lead the frontline states to liberation. While Miles, the compiler of the monograph, notes that Mvusi hung around with some of these leaders, it seems that his muteness in his writings about the ANC Youth League and about his camaraderie with this organization and its strong Africanist ideology hints at remarkable alterity. And this for me is very intriguing, especially today, we're living in the time of the hegemony of the ANC. And often when we try to speak things differently or when we try to articulate difference, we are likely to face a whole lot of criticism or unfair criticism. And this is the only reason why I decided to talk about Selby Mvusi, because he's virtually unknown, despite the fact that he attended the University of Fort Hare at the time of the formation of the ANC Youth League. And so you will realize that as you read the book, that he proposes an alternative, and this alternative unfolds in two steps that introduce complexities to the early African national resistance, particularly for its then grand ethnic narrative. And this is quite often, even today, when we are not even allowed to talk about the Xhosa Nostra, for example, or the dominance of Zulu nationalism within the ANC. And yet, ironically, it was Frantz Fanon, who in his treatise of national consciousness argued that, one of the pitfalls of national consciousness is its taking for granted ethnicity. And we're quite happy quoting Fanon, but we'll never quote Fanon. We rarely quote Fanon addressing the concept of, or the question or the problem of ethnicity and relating it to our present world. Perhaps responding to the valorization of the landscape such as we find in H.I.E. Dlomo's poem, Valley of a Thousand Hills, Mvusi revisits this space in his two poems, I and They, and in Pilgrimage to Zululand, highlighting various heterotopias. The bulk of this critique is inscribed in what he describes as the fantastical replay of the assassination of King Shaka. This anticlimax is elaborated upon in the fact that Mvusi inserts the age-old Isibongi eulogy with his dystopian view of Zululand. Those who are familiar with the Valley of a Thousand Hills will recall its lyricism. And often when you visit, the Valley of a Thousand Hills, it's a very breathtaking sight. It's beautiful. The landscape is extremely jaw-dropping. But rarely do we read into this landscape painful histories. And what Mvusi does is to look at Valley of a Thousand Hills, and he sees a whole lot of things, basically using an alternative realism in order to help us understand what later on I speak about, the problem of ethnicity. In the second stage, and again intimating a dialogue with H.I.E. Dlomo's construction of a new African, Mvusi experiments with the figure of the night watchman, making him the character focalizer of a series of the poem Night Watchman. In this project, the god recalls the feudal and traditional Zulu subject whom Dlomo and his contemporaries are concerned about for seemingly refusing to affirm black resistance struggle. Echoing Dlomo, Mvusi's night watchman also plies his trade as a god and is trapped in a time warp. This is so in the sense that he valorizes Christianity without contextualizing it within the European colonial moment. As Tim Cousins and Nick Fisser argue, in Dlomo's later writing, he adds a nationalist veneer to the public images of the South African ethnic nationalists such as Cetshwayo, Mshweshwe, Nzikana, etc. Primarily because of apartheid's racist censorship between 1950s and 60s, the drum decade, Dlomo's nationalist idiom is seldom heard. This lull is broken in the 70s in the outpour of what came to be termed struggle literature. However, rarely does this literature, as well as South African literary criticism, explore the failure of black oppressed subjects to hybridize ethnic nationalism with Christianity, such as arguably pioneered almost 2 centuries ago by Nzikana Kagaba, who was born about a century, as I said, a century earlier than Tiyo Soga. Nuancing Dlomo's depiction of the god, Mvusi creates multiple voices wherein his subject speaks in alterities and takes action in the only ways that he thinks possible. The imagined relationship takes place in the 3-part series of the eponymous poem Night Watchman from Zululand. It was published 3 times, 1957, 1960, and 1963. In length and substance, these poems collectively resemble a relay race, implying that the second takes over where the first one ends, while the third extends the narrative from where the second version concludes. This is why, in elaboration, the 1960 and 1963 versions of this poem conclude on a Socratic dialogue between Mvusi and the god addressed from the second narrative point of view, in contrast to the original 1957. Key to the dialogue is Mvusi's request of the god to, I quote, learn of fire reduced to ashes, unquote, perhaps because the 18th century Zulu civilization, as it's evident, I think, in its violent masculinities, perished with Mfecane and colonial conquest. As it were, what is to be severed is continued sustained warmth and an embracing of diverse ways of seeing, which is a metaphor of cosmopolitanism. So basically what I'm trying to argue here is that well before, many decades before, we began to speak about cosmopolitanism, globalization, post-coloniality, decoloniality, Mvusi and his contemporary, Mvusi in particular, was already experimenting with the concept of cosmopolitanism. And doing so, mostly helping us, as I explain later on, showing that he is in touch with avant-garde forms of art, European art, Cubism and Expressionism, and Picasso, to note a luminary of the time. Now, Mvusi's addressing of the Zulu god or night watchman from the second-person perspective essentially resists the binary opposition logic of the struggle literature's idiom, and also thus has the effect of sealing a curious intimacy with him. And this is in contrast to the latest struggle literature and criticism, which, as in Njebele Ndebele and others, Andries Oliphant to mention, have argued, very persuasively that such literature tended to replicate the surface realities of apartheid without taking us into the complexities. Why is it that a person ends up being an imbimbi, selling out on the struggle? And of course, as Ndebele has argued many times, there should be a difference between political rhetoric and creative intellectual writing. And it is on the lot that I think Mvusi is saying, well, let us try to understand why it is that African nationalist discourses were failed to win over ethnic nationalism. And it's not only Zulu nationalism, we later on in the 70s, in the form of Mangope's political ideology, we had the ANC unable to penetrate and win over that kind of Botswana ethnic nationalism. And of course, in today's Eastern Cape, the various regime of Sebe, Matanzima, that kind of reprobate and retrogressive form of Xhosa nationalism. And for many years, the ANC could not even penetrate. But this, unfortunately, is, collectively constitutes the skeleton in our closet, The question is, are we going to study only the brilliant things about ourselves? And in studying the brilliant things about ourselves, are we not again mythologizing, departing from the creative and intellectual mission? And I think Mvusi, many decades before the Second World War, was already doing that. As I said, he resists binary opposition logic by embracing this night watchman. And this allows him to define the God as a way that probes the psychological and existential aporia that resistant cultures tend to fail to win over. And of course, as I've already said, for decades, at least between 1970 and 1960s, the ANC-Inkatha rivalry escalated into bloodbaths, primarily because of the apparent failure to reconcile ethnic nationalism and anti-apartheid nationalism. This is because, according to Mvusi, the night watchman is caught in a paralyzing interregnum between the pre-modern and industrial political modernity. It is curious that, foregoing the realist narrative of resistant cultures, Mvusi attributes the God's dilemma to an affliction that he terms anxiety. This is a quandary that Mvusi says hinders a black person from becoming fully modern or nationalist, calling this subject contemporary man, quote unquote. Mvusi argues that he is apt to recoil into self-dreading anxiety, implicit in consciousness, quote unquote, because he boasts a glorious past of bravery and conquest caught up in a present which he cannot manipulate, quote unquote. So basically reminding us of all the interesting oral eulogizing poetry of Shaka Senzangakon, wena wemashobana, this and that and that and that. But then what happens, when we enter the contemporary world, such as we have, the world of the hashtag feast must fall? Don't we see similar predicaments unfolding very painfully in the public media, where recently, of course, only yesterday, a guard shot a student and they just are, a stone throw away? How do we explain that kind of psyche? And going back to the Marikana massacre, how do we explain the inability of our police officers and our guards to understand that when people talk and demand to be heard, that they should not be responded to through brutality and by maiming them? I've got 5 minutes? Okay, all right. So it is curious, rephrasing the present, which I've said, is that which I have compared to that of the hashtag feast must fall. Rephrasing the present, Mvusi argues that it is the order whose only hold on to the future is in terms of generations yet unborn. Quote unquote, Mvusi engages a psychoanalysis of black subjectivity at a time when, to Fanon, it is not possible to establish black ontology outside the colonial enterprise. He argues, very persuasively in the fact of blackness, a chapter in Black Skin, White Mass. Seemingly in elaboration, Mvusi shows these intricacies and the extraordinary in colorful myths in his art, such as the paradox of innocence. This is his art, which is actually his lithograph, which is oil on canvas. My argument basically here is that this is where he portrays images through an almost impossible exercise, that of developing a solution from water and oil. So you realize that what I've done here is I have proceeded from focusing on his poetry, on his poetic depiction of anxiety or the dilemma that disables a black person from being won over to black nationalist discourse, to his graphic depiction of the same dilemma. And you have it here exemplified in this image where the representations of individuals are hazy. The process itself, he has to mix oil with water, almost an impossible exercise. But this is indicative of creative artists. Thus signaling a turning point regarding the modern man, Mvusi embraces the god as his alter ego that is relying on a non-realist narrative. And this is very non-realist. You get a sense that, the individuals are in the process of trying to emerge from obscurity, but they are held by something almost supernatural. And rarely do we have people who refuse to exercise self-reflexivity, acknowledging that they could be wrong. But what we have about these subjects that Mvusi is showing is perhaps a sense that they are reflecting on themselves, but also held back by something extremely difficult. Now, you have a similar argument elaborated upon in this other image, where, Mvusi's subject, as well as in this one, appear behind dark halls or spirals of silhouettes, as it were, trapped in a somewhat, perhaps an unknown world, yet to emerge into the public podium. But, okay, I'm just about to conclude. Okay. But this sense of angst that I have just talked about, that he describes, that he talks about as anxiety, is upended in his other artwork, especially the one in which he borrows from Expressionism and Cubism. And this is one of them, where the black woman subject is depicted as being very muscular and composed of or drawn in very eye-grabbing silhouettes, as it were, bringing to sharp relief the negritude presentation of the woman on the pedestal, a black woman on a pedestal, one who is, continually eulogized and not contextualized within the two forms of oppression, white racism and patriarchy or hypermasculinity. Now, in concluding this argument, I then go on to basically remind myself that what Mvusi is trying to do here anticipates an important and a seminal argument waged by or developed by Njabulun Ndebele in the late 1970s, early 1980s about the ordinary. And my argument basically is that Mvusi, shows the way of what we mean by the ordinary. And so to conclude, allow me, Chair, only half a minute. What I've tried to do here is to talk about UNISA Press, or publishing press in particular, and to highlight its contribution to the arsenal of primary text necessary for us to indulge in multiple disciplines and world civilizations, and to celebrate alternatives from the grand narratives. And he does this well before the Second World War. Remember that one of the things that intellectual developments post-Second World War is postmodernism. And the argument basically here is that, while we talk about postmodernism, we need to pause and see whether well before 1945 we had local intellectuals who were already experimenting with idioms that later came to be manipulated and stolen by postmodern intellectuals. I've also tried to place the voice of Mvusi as offering us, opportunities to explore different alternatives. So on that note, Chairperson, thanks a lot.